Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink, the Daily Mail's weekly global news podcast. I'm David Patrikarakos, and I've spent the last 15 years covering foreign affairs and conflict in some of the world's most dangerous places. But even I have to ask, are we now staring into the abyss?
These ICE raids are going to continue. They are likely to continue throughout the country in all sorts of different municipalities. The vast majority of these places are going to be Democrat-controlled cities.
He could send troops using this justification absolutely anywhere in the country for pretty much any protest, regardless of whether they were violent, insurrectionists, anything like that. He could use it anywhere.
What the liberal Democrat mayors and governors are doing is very similar to what the right-wing governors of the South, the American South in the 1960s were doing.
The FBI is led by Kash Patel, who is a hardline, inexperienced ideologue, and his deputy is Dan Bongino, a right-wing podcast host. Who would ever have thought the FBI would be run by people like this?
You see your elected representatives more on, doing an Instagram video or behaving like an influencer than you actually see them legislating or debating in Congress.
Esper recalls Trump asking him during the Black Lives Matter protest, could we not use troops to shoot protesters in the leg?
Director Alex Garland's film Civil War seemed like a cinematic fever dream when it was released in the spring of 2024. It now looks more like a portent of doom, or perhaps even a guide map to the future of the land of the not-so-free. Tensions began to rise in downtown Los Angeles on Monday night after a mostly quiet day of protests against Donald Trump's deportation roundups, and following the administration's order to more than double the number of military forces being sent to the area. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who described Trump's initial deployment of the National Guard and US Marines as deranged, is suggesting that this is all a political stunt ahead of the president's planned military parade on Saturday. President Trump, in turn, called for the arrest of Gavin Newsom and said that a civil war would happen if you left it to people like him. There's that phrase again, civil war. Meanwhile, federal agents are showing up at elementary schools, seeking to grab children, lying about parental consent, and then hiding their own IDs. There is no indication of where these children will be taken. One school superintendent was forced to ask, what interest should a Homeland Security agent have in a first grader? Good question. Perhaps President Trump can tell us. Though, to be fair, he's probably too busy planning his 79th birthday this coming weekend. That's a lot of candles, and frankly, I'm skeptical that he'll be able to blow them all out. But then again, he'll be too busy finessing plans for the colossal military parade through Washington that he's got planned. 6,500 soldiers and a total of 84 M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles and Strykers, which will all trundle down Constitution Avenue all the way to the Washington Monument before parachutists from the Army's Golden Knights will present Trump with a folded American flag. Well, it beats a pair of socks. Here at Apocalypse Now, we didn't know that the military handed out flags for ducking service for bone spurs, but I guess every day's a school day for Donald. Sticking with the military, there's also Donald's Golden Dome, which sounds like a fast food franchise he might once have owned that went bankrupt, but it isn't. Meanwhile, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., perhaps worrying that he was being forgotten about, fired all 17 members of the Advisory Committee on Immunization for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, saying that the move would restore the public's trust in vaccines. Ah well, at least you've kept Elon Musk off the front pages for a few days, Donald. All of this in a scant 142 days since Trump was sworn in. That's all it has taken. Who knows what the next 150 days, let alone 3.5 years, might bring. Certainly not America. In a moment, we'll speak to Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist. But first, let's turn to Jamie Kirchick, New York Times op-ed writer and author who joins us from Washington, D.C. Jamie, welcome. So, Jamie, first off, how are things in D.C.? We saw each other there a few months ago, and I think people were already acclimatizing to Trump too. But even since then, he's making his mark, isn't he?
Yeah, we just had the opening of Les Miserables at the Kennedy Center last night, which the president and the first lady attended, being met by cheers, but also some boos, as well as a row of drag queens in the very front of the stage were present for that. We have the military parade on Saturday to celebrate the anniversary of the U.S. Army. And just the other day, I was walking not far from my home here in downtown DC, and I saw police cars making way for what looked like a motorcade, which is you see all the time in Washington, DC, the president or the vice president driving somewhere. But it was actually a long procession of these giant flatbed trucks carrying massive tanks that looked like they had served in the first Gulf War, which is not a sight you see often, if at all, in the streets of Washington, D.C. We're not really used to military parades where they trot out the hardware, so to speak.
I mean, this is kind of Trump in a single image. We've got tanks and drag queens.
Yes, it's very camp.
It is the kitsch of it all. And I need to ask you a question, Jamie. A very serious, Jamie, little question. The drag queens, did they have more makeup than Donald Trump on?
That's a very good question. I wasn't there, so it was difficult for me to say, but I did see some photos, and it looked like they were a little more heavily painted than he was.
Everything is kicking off, as we say in Britain, in America right now. Trump has sent the National Guard into LA, a move Governor Gavin Newsom has called deranged. How did we get here?
Well, I think we have to go back to Donald Trump's campaign, his first campaign in 2015 when he announced it. And he ran as a candidate who was going to close the border and deport immigrants who are here illegally. Not legal immigrants, people who are here illegally, who cross the border illegally. He won that election on the issue, on the strength of his position on immigration. And I would say he won re-election just this past fall, also on a pledge to tamp down seriously on illegal immigration, which, by the way, had increased astronomically during the Biden administration. There really was a border crisis, as even now most Democrats are willing to acknowledge. So he ran on that. And immigration is a federal competency. It is not a power that is left to localities, cities or states. It is something that the federal government has sole authority over, because the borders of the United States are the responsibility of the federal government, not the individual states. So when Donald Trump is ordering ICE, which is our Immigration and Customs Enforcement Bureau, when he's ordering those agents to go after people who are here illegally, he has every legal right to be doing that. You can argue that it's not moral, that there should be other ways of dealing with the presence of people who are here illegally, but he has the legal right to do that. Now you have to contrast that with this development phenomenon that's been happening over the past decade or so in a lot of liberal left-wing states and municipalities, which is they have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. And what that means is that they are, going to defy federal law, that they will not cooperate with their federal counterparts in the execution of immigration enforcement. They're basically declaring themselves, we are a welcome haven to people who are not here legally. And, we used to have the term illegal alien to describe illegal immigrants. And now there's this term that came about, kind of Orwellian, in my opinion, undocumented immigrant, which means that they just lack that minor thing of a passport, right? So again, this is not passing moral judgments on, I happen to be pretty liberal on the immigration question, but at the same time, I think it should be done legally. I want more immigrants coming to the country, but they should be coming legally. We should not have this situation where people are risking their lives to cross the border, and then they're working in the shadows and whatnot. But again, the American people didn't vote for that. Okay, the American people voted for a harsher, stricter immigration policy. So what has happened is that soon after the Trump came to power, in fact, the first day, they started sending out ICE agents to target, as they were saying, criminal illegal aliens. So these are people who are like murderers, rapists, like all these types of criminals that Trump has talked about. And that's what they targeted first. But he's created this sort of arbitrary daily quota that he wants, because he wants to be able to show that he's keeping up this constant pace of deportations. And so he sort of arbitrarily imposed this number of 3,000 illegals have to be, apprehended every day. And sometimes you can't find 3,000 criminal aliens in a day. And so then you start going for the day laborers in the parking lot of a Home Depot. I don't know what the British equivalent of a Home Depot is. It's a giant store that sells tools and construction materials. And often contractors will go in the morning, and there'll be a group of undocumented immigrants, to put it lightly, standing in the parking lot, and they will be picked up and they'll be brought to whatever job has to be done that day. These people are not breaking the law. They're very hard workers, okay? But again, they're technically not here legally. And again, the federal government has the right to apprehend them and deport them. And so what he's now been doing is sending ICE into Los Angeles, a place where it's a large Hispanic community, legally immigrant Hispanic community, but there's also a large illegal presence there as well. And so ICE has been going after those types of immigrants, trying to apprehend them. In response, there have been these protests, many of them peaceful, but also a lot of them not peaceful. And you can see videos and pictures of both in the media. The pictures and the images of the violent protests are extremely disturbing. There's one video you can find of a procession of federal vehicles, all these guys in SUVs. They're speeding down the street, presumably going to some sort of action that's taking place in a different part of the city. And there is a masked left-wing anarchist protester throwing bricks at these cars. I mean, that is like attempted murder, okay? So there's lots of chaos that's going on. And again, because we have this sanctuary state situation with Governor Newsom and the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, they've been very hesitant to use the police to protect the ICE officers who have to do their jobs. And so this is the pretext under which the president is now sending, or he's now federalized the National Guard, because the governor refused to do it. So he's federalized the National Guard, which is, again, a legal action. And so that's where we are today. And if I could draw one more interesting comparison, I'm not drawing a moral comparison here, but what the liberal Democrat mayors and governors are doing is very similar to what the right-wing governors of the South, the American South in the 1960s were doing, which is after the Supreme Court in 1954, in its Brown versus Board of Education decision, ruled that American public schools had to be desegregated. That was the federal government basically saying, you need to desegregate your schools to ensure civil rights. You had all these white Southern governors saying, no, we are going to offer massive resistance, was the term they used, to the federal government. George Wallace, the infamous governor of Alabama, said, I will stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent this from happening. And it did happen. He stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama, and the National Guard, which President Eisenhower had to federalize, actually had to go through him and move him to the side. So it's a very similar dynamic, but the political sides have sort of been reversed.
What I note, actually, at the end of all of this is you talk about this is the pretext. You use that word, the pretext. So you think there is actually something more to this. Is this a political move? There's many things being discussed here. On the one sense, we're not conspiracy theorists, but we understand how politicians manipulate news cycles. You had a huge blow up with Elon Musk. Some damaging stuff was coming out. Suddenly this happens. No one's talking about Musk Trump anymore. Also, he dislikes Gavin Newsom. And also, he likes throwing his weight around. Are all of these factors in what you see as this pretext?
I'm actually unsure whether or not the use of the National Guard is justified. I think it actually might have been justified. You had the head of the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department was saying, our men are overwhelmed. We need support. The protesters out there are extremely violent and they're trying to kill, the members of my force. So President Trump may have been right to do this. He may have been justified in doing it. That doesn't mean that there could be other ulterior motives in him doing this. This is very rare that the president ever does this, that the president federalizes the National Guard or sends in troops. He's also sent in 500 to 700 Marines. The last time it was done, interestingly, was a little over 30 years ago, also in Los Angeles in the 1992 LA riots, when the Los Angeles Police Department was completely overwhelmed by what was happening. And President George H.W. Bush sent in federal troops. What I think is worrisome to some people is that these ICE raids are going to continue. They're likely to continue throughout the country in all sorts of different municipalities. The vast majority of these places are going to be Democrat-controlled cities. And what I think people are concerned about is Trump going to be doing this every time he's deploying ICE to conduct raids of illegal immigrants? Is he going to be sending the National Guard, federalizing the National Guard in cities across the country? Then it becomes a sort of dangerous precedent or a particularly worrisome development. I'm kind of, cautioning against hysteria constantly, because there's a lot of that whenever Donald Trump's name is mentioned. But that is something that we need to be aware of.
If you think it was justified, do you think in the end actually Gavin Newsom was being delinquent and not doing as governor what he is supposed to do?
That's a good question. I think one could say that over the years, he's probably been delinquent in supporting immigration policies that have allowed this problem to proliferate. But this is such a difficult issue in America because, like you said, these people are hardworking. They are not breaking the law, right? The vast majority of immigrants in this country are not lawbreakers. But at the same time, we had this debate before, over 10 years ago, over a process called amnesty, which is something whereby the US government would legalize all of these people, estimated at 20 million or more, who have been living in the country. Perhaps they came here illegally, but if you've been working and you haven't committed a crime, then we will give you citizenship, perhaps on the condition that you pay a penalty. That was sort of the arrangement. There was a bipartisan effort to pass a bill that would have done this. Marco Rubio was the Republican leader on that. John McCain had been a sponsor of this for years. That bill failed. And the Republican support for that bill, which, by the way, this idea goes back to George W. Bush, okay, who was a very different type of Republican when it came to the issue of immigration, if you remember, compassionate conservatism and all that. So the rise of Donald Trump was really in large part in response to the elite leadership of the Republican Party trying to go along with some kind of amnesty deal. It was supported by big business. Okay, that was a major Republican constituency that likes the idea of constant supply of cheap labor, right? And Trump, who's kind of a political genius, understood that most Republicans in the country did not like this. They did not like the idea of amnesty. They were immigration hawks. They wanted mass deportations, but for whatever reason, they were not being represented at the top levels of the Republican Party. And he came in, he seized on that issue, and he made it a winning issue. And it now commands majority support in this country. And so what Donald Trump is doing has the support of the American people. I do not think that he will be losing. Poll numbers will go down. I think actually, if you look at the pictures coming out of Los Angeles now, it's the Democratic governor and the Democratic mayor who look like they're weak, who look like they are standing on the side of illegal aliens and the anarchists who are out there to support them, throwing rocks and stones and bricks at law enforcement and the U.S. military. I think it's a politically disastrous issue right now for the Democrats. They don't know how to deal with it. And they really do need to adjust their political views. And it looks like they haven't really learned anything from 2020, right? When there were similar episodes of mass violence across the United States. And most Democratic politicians at the time did not want to criticize it because they didn't want to be seen as being opposed to, racial justice protesters.
I was in LA over January when the wildfires hit. And let me tell you, Karen Bass, Gavin Newsom, they did not come out of that well. So I think Donald Trump sees a weak target here in those two.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Bass is just an incompetent, really. And that was revealed when she was in Ghana for whatever reason. When the fires happened, despite being told in advance that the weather conditions were likely to cause some kind of natural disaster. And there's that, awful video of her being attacked by this British journalist, of course, on the jetway in LAX airport upon her return. And then Newsom is also easily portrayed as this rich elite, San Francisco liberal who's eating at one of America's most expensive restaurants during the pandemic in total violation of social distancing rules. I mean, he's just compared to Trump. I mean, it's just there's no match really.
We have been taught, Jamie, we've grown up. Populists emerge from the Weimar Republic, from times of real economic strife. But the United States has been through 10, 20 years of, pretty stable times. Yes, we had a bit of a financial crisis here and there, but life in the United States is pretty good, Jamie. It's been pretty good. Are we not learning a lesson here, which is that, populists can rise in periods of great turmoil, but they can also rise from countries that are actually pretty rich, pretty powerful, and pretty safe?
Well, I think the United States is all those things in comparison to most of the world. But over the last 20 years, it's really undeniable that there has been a stagnation of wages for working class people, that globalization has not worked for a lot of working class people, not just in America, but certainly in Britain and Europe and many other developed parts of the world. And so there's been a kind of relative, I don't know if you call it decline, but maybe a relative stagnation within the, if you're comparing the US in the past 20 years to the post-war period, certainly. There was a massive economic boom after World War II. America was like the only country standing, right, that hadn't been destroyed. So it was an amazing period of growth for the United States. And we went through, ups and downs, obviously, beginning in the 1970s. The 90s were pretty great. But really, the globalization, while it's brought many fruits to many people, there have been many victims of it as well. And I think what Donald Trump was able to do is he was able to sense that feeling and he was able to exploit it, and not in a productive way, obviously, in a very negative way. And essentially talking about enemies of the country all around the world and within the country and the elites and all this, a very kind of negative campaign message. But I absolutely do believe that we need to have a little less kind of rosy picture of what America has been over the past 20 years. It's been easy for people like me, like journalists living in the coastal cities. You know what I mean? That's a very different life. It's a very different life. Or it's the same for you. People in London have had a very different experience of globalization than people in the Midlands or the North, right? So that really, I do think, explains a lot of it. But the immigration question is a huge part of it. And that's an issue that upper middle class and wealthier people have not been exposed to the negative effects of immigration. They are not going to hospitals that are crowded with people here illegally. Their children do not go to schools, with the children of people who are here illegally. They're not depending on the social services of the federal government, the local state governments, in the way that lower income people are. And that's why ultimately you will see support for what the president is doing right now in Los Angeles.
But one thing that strikes me, and I've got to ask you about this because I can't quite get past this, the lack of domestic opposition here. And I sometimes think, Jamie, if this was a parliamentary system, if Donald Trump had to go before the Senate, Congress once a week for some equivalent of PMQs, maybe he wouldn't do so much of this stuff. But we're seeing here real huge amounts of executive power concentrated in one man, aren't we? And it makes me realize something else. So much of American politics is about custom and protocol and relying on the president actually to just behave in a correct manner, which largely speaking they've done. But now we've got something different.
No, you're absolutely right. And, it's the executive branch of the government that executes the laws. And when you have at the top of the executive branch a man who doesn't seem to care much for these traditions and customs and norms, it can be a very difficult situation. So we have several ongoing disputes right now where the executive branch has withheld congressionally appropriated funding to certain government institutions, and president of the executive branch is refusing to disperse those congressionally appropriated funds, and it's now in the courts. This stuff hasn't really happened before, right? Because we had presidents, the president might not want to fund a particular thing, but if the Congress votes for it, it's his duty, it's his constitutional duty to sign off on it so the money can go to that, serve that function. We've never really had a president. I mean, I think Richard Nixon might have done it once or twice, and he was overridden by the courts and he followed the orders. I agree with you about the lack of opposition within the Democratic Party. I look on Saturday, the same day that this, garish spectacle will be taking place in, a couple blocks from where I live. There's going to be protests in 150 cities across the country against the president. I think the Democratic Party is in a very bad spot right now. They don't really have a leader. It's not Kamala Harris. Obviously, she's back in California. She's not really being heard from that much. Who is it? Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader? I don't think so. So there's all these kinds of factions within the party. You have a lot of, it's almost like a reality show. Being a member of Congress or the Senate is increasingly like being an influencer. And you see your elected representatives more on, doing an Instagram video or on Twitter or kind of, behaving like an influencer than you actually see them legislating or debating in Congress, right? So you have all these faces competing for attention. And what it leads to is a very sort of diffused, dispersed message, right? There isn't a single kind of Democratic Party message right now. And Trump, I will also say, is very good at putting the Democrats in places where he suspects or knows that they'll take the bait, right? And so it should not be difficult right now for Democrats, for instance, to say, while I disagree with the president's immigration policies, and I believe his, sending ICE into churches and all these, I think it's terrible. At the same time, we must respect the rule of law, and these protests are absolutely outrageous, and law enforcement should do everything it can do to protect the law-abiding citizens of Los Angeles and arrest and punish the people who are breaking the law. The only Democrat who's really come out and said that clearly is Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who for various reasons is become this kind of like very interesting rogue Democrat on a lot of different issues. He comes from a working class support base. He started in the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. He's kind of a political maverick, okay? But I've yet to hear other Democrats come out with the message that I just said.
It's funny, you talk about as well, Trump able to just put the Democrats where he wants them. I mean, this is his superpower. He drives people crazy. I remember once someone saying to me, look, I don't like Donald Trump, but every time he drives Rachel Maddow crazy, I just like him a little bit. I feel better about him.
I mean, yes, and I will admit to having similar feelings on several occasions. I think the thing that we've lost in this country is the ability to distinguish between a man who says things that make you feel good, that make you laugh, that scores political points, but separating that impulse from the actual need to govern responsibly. And it's like, I would love Donald Trump if he were just a kind of political commentator or a lounge act. Most of his speeches these days sound like a Don Rickles routine, you know what I mean? And there's probably a British analog to Don Rickles that we could come up with to, so your listeners will understand what I'm saying. He also reminds me of Benny Hill in some ways too, right? That's a different, that's fine, okay? But that shouldn't be the president of the leader of the free world. You know what I mean? And I think because politics and entertainment in this country have become so intertwined in many ways that people have sort of lost the ability to distinguish between the two. And so Trump is, as much of an entertainer as he is like a political leader, as someone who governs. And I think a lot of his supporters support him for that reason, because they think he's entertaining. They might not even think he's good at being the president, but they've lost trust in the political system that to them it doesn't matter, right? That like Nancy Pelosi's a clown, they're all clowns, okay? But Trump is the funniest and the meanest of the clowns. And so I'm going to go with him. He's kind of the alpha dog, right? And that, I think, is a worrying development.
Thank you, Jamie Kirchick, New York Times op-ed editor and author. We'll return after the break with Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist, to look at the implications of Trump's military flex. Welcome back to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. Unsurprisingly, we're still talking Trump. Now we're joined by Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist. Shashank, let's get right into it. How did we get here? Why on earth has Donald Trump sent the National Guard into Los Angeles, a move Governor Gavin Newsom has called deranged?
Well, to understand this, you have to go back and understand the Trump administration's policy on deporting illegal immigrants, who they accuse of being part of a so-called foreign invasion. And to do that, Trump has sent in ICE, so Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I think that stands for, into these cities. There is a suspicion he may be targeting democratic states, democratic cities that are particularly associated with his opponents. That has prompted protests in Los Angeles. People have fought back. And so what he has done is that he has mobilized part of the National Guard. The National Guard is a kind of reserve part of America's armed forces, which is generally held on a state-by-state basis, but he can federalize and mobilize parts of it. And he's done it under a very strange sort of legal justification, which we can get into if you're interested in it. But basically, it doesn't allow these Marines to go and act like police. They can't arrest people in a normal sense. They can't, do law enforcement functions, but they can protect federal agents. In other words, they can protect the immigration people who are rounding up undocumented immigrants, undocumented migrants. And so that is what he's done. He hasn't invoked posse comitatus, which is the US law that allows him to use the military for domestic purposes, but he's done this more arcane thing that is quite controversial.
We had this big fallout with Elon Musk. Elon Musk made some damaging accusations. The next day, or the next couple of days, he does this. Now, as I say, we don't need to get into conspiracy theories, but I do understand the way that politicians manage and exploit news cycles.
I think that there is a real attraction to Donald Trump of using the military for these purposes. And David, this, as you remember, goes right back to his first term in office. If you remember the testimony from one of his first defense secretaries, Mark Esper, in his first term, Esper recalls Trump asking him during the Black Lives Matter protests that rocked Trump in the end of his term, could we not use troops to shoot protesters in the leg? And Mark Esper was shocked by this. But I think part of the appeal for Trump is that sense of projecting military strength, right? We're talking about this justice. We're on the cusp of a big military parade in Washington, D.C., which has long been one of Trump's fantasies, having a big, strong military parade like the one he saw on Bastille Day in France. So I think part of it is, yes, kind of attacking political opponents, targeting democratic states, democratic cities, potential future presidential candidates like Gavin Newsom. But I think part of it is just his deep, abiding affinity for using the military, what he thinks of as his military, for strength and muscle flexing.
I'm not saying Trump is a dictator, of course not, but he does have autocratic tendencies. And one thing I've noticed about dictatorship is that it sits really closely next to kitsch. And there is nothing more kitschy than Donald Trump, the orange peroxide.
The macho man playing at the campaign rallies.
Exactly. So are we just seeing Trump's ego and id play out across the state of California now?
Well, it is that, David, but I think it's more dangerous than that because this is unprecedented, right? The last time a president sent in troops against the wishes of the state, against the wishes of the governor of the state, was, I think, 1965. That was over segregationist protests. And this is a big deal. This legal backing that Trump has used for this is unprecedented because in theory, it's completely elastic, right? It's not confined to Los Angeles. He could send troops using this justification absolutely anywhere in the country for pretty much any protest, regardless of whether they were violent, insurrectionists, anything like that. He could use it anywhere. So this is more than ego. This is a dangerous moment in the relationship between America's military and its politicians. There was a big rally you would have seen at Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg is a big military base. Trump goes to this base, and it's just an extraordinary level of politicization. You have campaign hats, campaign clothing. He's criticizing the protesters in Los Angeles, some of whom are violent, of course, but criticizing them as foreign saboteurs, foreign invaders. And to say this to troops who have the power of, using armed force, I think that's a very, very dangerous moment in American history.
This erasure of norms, do you fear now that one day there might be a Trump-like figure, but who's actually politically competent, beyond campaigning, who's actually got a concentration span? Is this where we're heading?
There is this deep-seated assumption in America that the country is beyond the frailties and pathologies and dangers of other lesser countries in other parts of the world. It could never happen here, right? We could never be susceptible to democratic backsliding. But you've had a Supreme Court that has effectively said acts that the president carries out in his official duties can't be illegal. And that judgment is just very far-reaching. This isn't the first time we've had issues, David, over executive power, right? I mean, people who remember the Bush era after 9/11 will remember debates over illegal warrantless wiretapping by the NSA, one of America's intelligence agencies. They will remember the Patriot Act, which was a very draconian counterterrorism legislation. They will remember sticking people into Guantanamo Bay. So we have had these profound debates over authoritarian practices, of course, in the Nixon era as well. But what's different about this, I think, is we've never had a president who so flagrantly has questioned the legitimacy of elections, questioned the legitimacy of term limits, has talked about running again for other terms. So I'm not only worried, David, about a future more competent would-be authoritarian. I still think that we have 3 years left to run, more than 3 years left to run in this administration. And I am not yet convinced that when Trump jokes about these things, that these are simply comments made in jest.
With that in mind, Shashank, we're talking about the immediate issues. Downtown in LA is now on a curfew for a second night. Similar protests have popped up across the US, and Mayor in Spokane has announced a state of emergency. There are now fears that Trump might use all of this as a pretext to impose martial law. Surely it can't come to that.
No, I don't think it will. I don't think it will. I think there's still too many sources of resistance. I think Republicans in Congress who have been, as you know, pretty supine so far would probably stand up to such a move. It would be such a great leap. So I still think that right now that is unlikely. That is unlikely. But you know what I also worry about, David, is not just the domestic implications of this. It's that, we're in a moment, as you've covered on your podcast and from many different angles, of great geopolitical upheaval and tension. And America's armed forces are losing their military edge to China in the Pacific. What does it mean when you're taking your military that has to be able to compete with the People's Liberation Army, compete with other authoritarian states, and you're effectively deploying huge chunks of it to the southern border, talking about the invasion of Mexico, and you're basically feeding it with this story of domestic invasion? So I think that's deeply troubling for America's military readiness. The one note of consolation I take is that, not long before we were having this conversation, America's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, gave testimony to Congress. And he was asked, do you think this is an invasion? And you could tell he was in a very awkward position because he has to pick between telling the truth and saying, this is not an invasion, and placating his boss or contradicting his boss and saying, my boss is wrong, the commander-in-chief is wrong. But he actually stood up. He showed a spine and said, this is not an invasion. And to say that, to have a principal military advisor to the president who is willing to say that, just as James Mattis, as defense secretary, was willing to stand up in his first term, that is a profoundly important thing at this stage.
How much of American politics is down to custom and protocol? Structurally, we're seeing in American politics a flaw that can be exploited by someone in that office.
It's more than that. It's not just the expansion of executive power. It's an erosion of the legal constraints that can push back against it. And the one I worry about greatly is the sweeping pardons that were issued to the rioters and insurrectionists who assaulted the American Capitol on January 6th. And Trump incited that mob, but what's in a way more important is that he effectively expunged their legal records. He expunged their convictions. And what does that tell us? It tells us that if you're someone who is being asked to break the law on behalf of the president, you can do so in reasonable confidence that you will be forgiven for any breaches of the law you commit, whether that is a National Guardsman who chooses to shoot a protester in an unlawful way, whether that is a FBI official who chooses to pursue and harass political opponents. If you have that breakdown of the legal process by the pardon power, that's, anything goes, because the law doesn't matter anymore in that sense.
Or the law can be abused, exploited by bad actors. Aren't the Proud Boys now this far-right organization trying to sue the government?
Yeah, well, they've had, if you look at the far-right movement in America, it's been given a wink and a nod, and it has very powerful allies at the upper echelons of America's government. So it's not just sort of legal protection and political protection. There's a kind of ideological blessing that flows from the very top. And if you're thinking about the people who would normally be tracking these movements, like the FBI, who is leading the FBI right now? I'm more comfortable about the CIA, which is led by John Ratcliffe, who by all accounts is inexperienced, but nonetheless is viewed as something of a professional. The FBI is led by Kash Patel, who is a hardline, inexperienced ideologue, and his deputy is Dan Bongino, a right-wing podcast host, who, again, is an out-and-out ideologue. Who would ever have thought the FBI would be run by people like this?
Because Trump values loyalty. I mean, the pardons, for example, as well as excusing your political allies or your supporters, is a recipe for corruption. And again, was largely not abused due to the integrity of the people in the office. But we realize that's actually no safety valve.
Well, no, look at the most recent example, which is the gift by Qatar of a huge aircraft for use as Air Force One. And the Trump administration is openly acknowledging that at the end of the term, it will be transferred as a gift to Trump personally. That's quite extraordinary, not just on the grounds of why is America accepting a jet from a foreign power with all the security implications that may have for bugs and surveillance, but more significantly, this looks to me on the face of it like gross, absolutely gross corruption. And it follows on the back of Trump's family members profiting handsomely off the back of his position in office, which is very concerning. Not just that, you mentioned Elon Musk. You alluded to Elon Musk earlier on. Musk himself, when there was an AI summit on in the Middle East, Musk reached out to people saying, if you don't include me and my companies, I will block this effort by the president. So you have an entire culture that has normalized what we see in many other parts of the world, which is people around the executive branch and the leader himself abusing their power in office, abusing their institutional position for personal gain. And that, we should never stop noting how deeply troubling and appalling that is.
Where is the domestic opposition to Donald Trump?
I think the Democratic Party is still reeling from its catastrophic defeat in the elections. It's organizing itself. It's undergoing that kind of internal recrimination and splits that many parties do in the aftermath of bad defeat, particularly left-wing ones. And we see that, in Europe as well sometimes. But I think the mainstay of opposition ought to have been the center ground of the Republican Party. But the Republican Party has become so deeply radicalized because it has realized that any dissenters or opponents tend to get punished at the ballot box and that Trump can direct primary campaigns against them. It's become supine. And for me, the bit that really drove this home, David, was seeing the aftermath of President Zelensky's humiliation in the Oval Office, which was shocking for everyone to see. And you would have thought Ukraine supporters in America would stand up and say to the president, this is completely unacceptable. What did we see? We saw Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. We saw Lindsey Graham, a kind of stalwart Republican hawk, turn around and basically double down against Zelensky and say that Trump did a great thing. Trump stood up for America in this humiliating act. That, to me, nothing more symbolizes to me the complete collapse of the sensible wing of the Republican Party at that moment.
I agree. And what I don't understand is this. Yes, he can direct primary campaigns against you. Sometimes, though, isn't it better to just resign on principle, even if you're being calculating? If you've got to think 5 years down the line, this is probably going to look a lot better.
I think that last part of what you said is so important, isn't it? Does it look better in 5 years? Because is Trump an aberration in American politics, in Republican politics, or is he the future of Republican politics? And if you think about succession, putting aside more extreme scenarios where he tries to do a Medvedev-Putin and sort of swaps places with J.D. Vance, people like Vance are effectively what you identified earlier on. They are more competent versions of pro-MAGA ideologues. That's probably a simplification of Trump's political ideology because it is more nuanced than that, I think. I do think Vance is someone who is kind of more interesting ideologically than Trump. But the point is, the old style Republicans who would once have stood up and backed a appropriations bill for Ukraine, a supplemental for Ukraine, it was a big fight last year. Those Republicans have basically are looking at the direction of the party and realizing that they've lost.
Right now, you have one feral party. If the Democrats decide the way to win is to become left-wing Republicans, what then for the future of the United States?
Well, you're right. I mean, there was a recent organization, Next Gen America, which is a big, left-wing campaign organization that basically said the party should learn from Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, right, and focus on those issues. And that is the debate sort of happening. It's partly a debate over economic issues and how to think about tariffs, protectionism, industrial policy. And Biden kind of tacked in that direction with his idea of a foreign policy for the middle class. But the really divisive bit that you, David, you know better than I do, is the culture war and how they think about alignment on the culture war agenda when the Republican Party and Trump has used an anti-woke agenda as the sort of central platform of their position in a very aggressive way, in ways that I think even some kind of a lot of mainstream people think has gone too far, right? In the military side, I talk to a lot of military officers who say the fact that we're now removing books from the library at West Point and the Naval Academy because they're seen to be woke, but in fact, these are just kind of mainstream classics of American literature. This is a sign this whole thing has gone too far. So the Democrats are asking, do we lean into this? Do we step back from the cultural issues and the politics of transgender rights in America, which are highly divisive, very salient to politically engaged people, but very off-putting to a very large number of other Americans? And by the way, as you know, David, this is the very same debate that the left has had in the UK, right? And has reached a very different place in the centre-left in the Labour Party. Or do we double down? Do we sort of say we need someone who can engage the base? And did Biden, for example, on issues like Gaza, did Biden lose because he was partly too weak on Gaza and turned off a great many pro-Palestinian voters? I think these debates have a long way to run. And if you think about the political cycle, we're at a very early stage. Trump is what? He is 6 months into his term, less than 6 months into his term. We have 3.5 years to go. The next big juncture will be the midterm elections. And I think that will send the signal, the electoral signal that will inform both the Republicans and the Democrats as to where the public mood is headed. And we're not going to know an awful lot until that happens.
I have to ask you, Shashank, where does this come from? This is not the 1930s. America's not been in a Great Depression. There's been no Wall Street crash. In fact, what you've seen is stability, ever-increasing prosperity. Why then does a country that actually has it pretty good turn to Donald Trump? Not once, but twice.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question and would need a PhD thesis to answer properly. But I rely on my colleagues at The Economist to tell me these kinds of things because, as you know, I'm not an expert on politics, but I'm quite persuaded by some of the arguments they make, which are that the inflationary shocks of the pandemic had a really profound and long-lasting effect on American politics. And although the prices eventually stabilized, it was baked in, and people were very, very angry about that. And if you look at the list of the polling that we've done it, my colleagues have done, Trump is very unpopular, so we should say that. But if you ask people, what are the most important issues facing America, right? Whether it's Democrats, whether it's Republicans, and in fact, it's Republicans by a higher margin, it is inflation. That is number one. Right? Jobs and the economy is number two. Healthcare is number three. Immigration, the issue on which we began our conversation, that is precipitating this kind of political clash in Los Angeles, it is number four. It is the most important issue only for 2% of Democrats, 13% of Republicans. So this tells you something, that this perception of the cost of living, the perception of affordability has done a lot to shape the backlash against Biden and his loss, I think, which is not to say that Trump can fix it. And indeed, he is also headed, I think, to quite a serious reckoning when it becomes apparent to voters that his policies, notably tariffs that you mentioned, are going to make the problem worse. And they will find that out in due course, and he will be punished for it.
I mean, I would point out as well, Trump was elected before COVID the first time. It's just extraordinary. And I start to wonder if perhaps a certain amount of boredom sets in. People forget the problems of populists of the past. The war, the dictators of the past have receded into history. And I think people perhaps sometimes are just looking for something a bit different.
Yeah. David, on that point, by the way, you mentioned, the wars of the past are a really important factor here as well, which is that you look at the people around Trump, Hegseth, Vance, Gabbard, these are veterans of the wars on terror, people who felt America wasted 20 years of blood and treasure for pointless wars, pointless nation-building exercises. Trump very effectively, highly effectively channels that sense of grievance, resentment, frustration, disappointment, disillusionment, I think is the word, and channels it to very good effect. But of course, we're in the middle of a period in which he may be forced to then reckon between his desire to avoid foreign entanglements, true to that sense of pulling America out, and his need to be able to stamp his authority on the Middle East with an Iran crisis that is brewing. And I think it's going to be a very difficult call for him, but his instinct is to stay the hell out.
You are, as you say, the Economist defense editor. I wanted you on here because we want to talk about the legal ramifications of getting those Marines there, of deploying those Marines, of having military presence in your own states. But let's just end on this military parade, this bit of kitsch, this military kitsch that Trump loves. Do you have any sense of what we're going to see rolling down those roads? Are they going to bring out the big guns?
They are literally going to bring out the big guns. In fact, those guns, David, are so big that the streets of Washington, D.C. cannot cope with the weight and will literally break. And the U.S. Army is, as we speak, I believe, busy sticking big metal plates on corners where the tanks will have to turn. They have promised to pay for the damage they caused. But you know what? Amid all of this stuff, there is a sense that, this is Trump being a sort of authoritarian figure having a parade. I'm not so concerned about that, right? We have in the UK Trooping of the Colour, the King's birthday parade, just coming up on the weekend. In France, they know how to hold a good military parade. India, the world's the biggest democracy. There's a big military parade every year. The parade's not the point. The point is the spirit behind it. The point is the attitude to the armed forces. The point is that breakdown of civil military norms that you talked about. That's the point, not the spectacle, because I enjoy a few tanks rolling down a street as much as anyone.
Shashank, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to both my guests, Jamie Kirchick, New York Times op-ed writer and author, based in Washington, D.C., and Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist. Join me, David Patrikarakos, next time as we continue to bring you dispatches from a world on the brink. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at Apocalypse Now Pod, and you can get in touch via email at apocalypsenowpod@dailymail.com. We'll see you again next week as we ask once again, Apocalypse Now?